Yes, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and I hope you're continuing to enjoy my video content with regards looking at these old school vintage dirt bikes. We're just trying to keep you entertained until we start a brand new racing season in 2025, because as you know, the current 2024 classic racing season is now done and dusted for another year, but we've got plenty videos here for you to take a look at through the winter period, or at least until we get to February, when of course we'll be attending the annual Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. So let's crack on with another nice video, and I'm going to go back to the Terry Pickering Classic Motorcycle Collection for this next posting. So we're now going to take a look at Terry's 1981 400 CanAm. So let's take a look. Now, it's been quite some time since we've featured one of these CanAms here on my channel, so it was quite fortunate that during my recent visit to Terry Pickering's motorcycle collection that I spied this example here, which was quite a recent addition to Terry's hoard of rare and classic two-wheelers, which is why I always try and make that 400 odd mile journey south to Terry's Aladdin's Cave each and every year, just to see what kind of project he's currently working on, or what kind of bikes he's added to his collection. But you can see here that Terry's got some quite nice toys to play with, and among this little assortment here, he's also got some rare and wonderful specimens of old school off-road history, and he's fast at running out of space to try and contain them all. And if I know Terry, rather than thin out the herd and sell a few bikes to make some space, he'd probably see it as a much simpler solution to build another shed, because not only has he got those old scramblers there, he's also got quite a comprehensive collection of vintage road bikes as well, including an original Brough Superior and other nice classics. So when it comes to having your own private motorcycle museum to look at each and every day, you can see that Terry's going to be very busy keeping this lot in tip-top condition. And it's also hard to think that this is just a small sample of what Terry has in his possession. But anyhow, getting back to our featured bike, which is a CanAm 400 Twinshocker from 1981. And in fact, this particular bike here is number 00001 that came off the CanAm production line in that year. So this was of course the very first bike of this model that was made in that year. But I'm sure you're already aware that Terry's quite well known for his bike restorations, which is basically what keeps him busy now in his retirement years. But in actual fact, our bike here hasn't been restored by Terry or anybody else, as far as I know, and this 400 CanAm was yet another bike that Terry had shipped into the UK from the United States, and this bike here was part of a consignment of machines that Terry purchased. So you can see that it's still in quite good original condition, and with it being the first of what I think is an MX6B model that came off the production line in 81, it all adds to the history and the interest that accompany a bike such as this. So with regards to the history of CanAm, who I'm sure you already know were a subsidiary of the Canadian-based VRP, or Bombardier Recreational Products, that were, I think they were founded way back in 1972, and as I remember, I think they were based in Valcourt in Quebec in Canada. But they made all manner of off-road motorcycles, from I think it was 1972 up to about 1987, but sometime later they were reformed in 1997 to make ATVs as well as their famous Spider three-wheeler. Although the complete history of Bombardier and its CanAm subsidiary is quite long and complex to cover in this short video, but if you want to know the full story, then certainly take a look at Chris Marsh's CanAm website, because Chris's website has the full story and loads of valuable information on these CanAm motorcycles, and Chris is seen as an encyclopedia of all things CanAm, so certainly take a look at his webpage for all of the intricate details. But just in case you're remotely interested, they say that the CanAm name was the result of an in-house employee competition among Bombardier's workers, and allegedly this CanAm name was the result of their future anticipated trade with the American market, where they hoped to do most of their business. So it was just a simple combination of Canadian and American titles, or CanAm for short. So our featured bike here, as I said, I'm pretty sure is an MX6B model, obviously from 1981, but correct me if I'm wrong here, I think these MX6Bs were said to be the last motocross model that CanAm produced, although there was a rumour to say that there was an MX7 made in 1982, but very little is actually known about that bike, as virtually no pictures or even examples of that bike are still in circulation. And besides, this was about the same time that CanAm were coming to an end, so it's not surprising that there's little known about that particular model. So let's start by taking a look firstly at the bike's chassis, which was quite similar to many bikes of the 1980s period, with a light tubular steel chassis, and as far as I know, this frame was quite strong and never had much in the way of flexing when it was worked hard on the track. But regards the colour, is of course a kind of orangey colour, or if you want to give it its full title, its paint code I think was RAL 2004, if you want to get technical. And although the bike's frame was made of steel, the rear swing arm on this machine was made of a much lighter alloy, which I suspect was maybe just to keep the all-up weight of the bike to a decent level. Not that it was a heavy machine, you understand, because I think it was only around the 236 pounds dry weight, so for a bigger 400 it wasn't too bad when you consider that the smaller 250 was around the 225 pound mark. And if my aging memory serves me correctly, it was these MX6Bs that had the alloy swing arm with the earlier MX6s from 1980 that had just a stock standard steel swing arm. And as we move on to the engine in our CanAm, which as you're already aware is an Austrian-built two-stroke Rotax power plant, which is basically the same engine that powered most of the CanAm crossers of that period, which were all super powerful and about as tough as an anvil. And as long as you looked after these engines properly, then these Rotaxes could give you good service, with this 400 derivative said to pump out around the 40 horsepower mark. So this engine had plenty ponies when it came to putting down the power. And again, the motor's casings, or at least part of them, had magnesium casings, and here on the ignition side of the engine it was a Bosch CDI ignition system that was used to create the spark to get that Rotax engine fired into life. But you can also see that Bombardier have added their own logo to this Rotax engine, which was quite a common thing for the time, as Rotax did supply these two-stroke engines to many different manufacturers in the 1980s, and usually they all ended up putting their own logo on these ignition casings, with the likes of SWM and Pooch just being two examples that spring to mind. But regardless of whose name was added onto the side of the engine, these were still all essentially Rotax manufactured power plants. So as we move across onto the transmission side of our Rotax engine, we had a wet oil-cooled multi-plate clutch that I think had several plates inside its basket, with a combination of steel and cork driven plates, and I'm also sure that the cogs inside this casing were a 5-speeder, which was usually borne in enough gears to keep your left foot dancing up and down on the shifter, and to keep that Rotax motor buzzing along. But you can also see that in 1981, motorcycle manufacturers were still fitting these skinny steel footrests to their scramblers, which didn't offer a lot of support for the rider's feet. But thankfully nowadays you can upgrade these skinny pegs for much wider and more comfortable footrests, which of course are a lot less harmful on the rider's feet. So when it came to the fueling of our MX6 CanAm Rotax, it was usually the job of a 38mm Mikuni carburetor, although as I remember, I think on some of the smaller models, like maybe the 175 and the 250s, it was quite often a big Bing carburetor that was used on those smaller machines. But it's quite hard to get a good look at the Mikuni that's fitted onto this 400 engine, due to it being kind of obscured by that remote reservoir there on the bike's rear suspension. But with regards to the air filter, it was normally a foam type K&N filter that was fitted inside this black plastic airbox, and usually for any kind of cleaning or maintenance, the air filter was accessed from underneath the bike seat. So there's no doubt that this Can-Am is in beautiful condition, and I'm not entirely sure just how much track action this bike's actually had since 1981, because as you can see, most of this 400 is in remarkable condition for a 43-year-old off-roader, and this exhaust expansion chamber in particular looks like it's still brand new, and it looks like it's just been removed from the wrapper and then bolted straight onto the chassis. With you can see there's no signs at all of any dents, abrasions or bruises. But having said that, many of the other parts on our Can-Am are in pretty much the same condition, so the state of this exhaust isn't really a big surprise, considering all of the other components that are fitted on to the bike. And as we move on to the back of the exhaust system, you can see we have more original stock parts on our bike's exhaust, with this tailpipe here, which again is still the self-same part that was bolted onto the bike in 1981, because quite often these kind of original components did tend to get damaged, and rather than maybe try and locate an 81 replacement, riders often just substituted the tailpipe for a much more modern replacement, like maybe a shorter alloy pipe. But again, you can see that this tailpipe here is in perfect condition, and I expect that there will be quite a decent crack from this part when that Rotax engine gets fired into life. So as we move on to the front end of our MX6B, we've got a nice pair of Italian Marzocchi forks, and if you're a regular viewer to my channel, you've probably already heard me mention many times on some of the other videos in the past about how popular these Marzocchis were on many of the European bikes of the 1980s era. But naturally these Marzocchis weren't a patch on modern day suspension systems, but back in the good old days of the 1980s, these Italian suspension units were still considered among some of the best of their kind, which is why they were so popular. But they didn't have much scope for tuning to the rebound and compression settings, although you could certainly improve them by maybe experimenting with different weights of fork oil, or maybe changing the internal spring rates, or you could even add or remove low pressure air into the fork stanchions through these Schrader valves that were fitted on the top of each fork leg. But to be fair, adjusting the air pressure inside these forks did very little to improve their performance. But at the risk of repeating myself, as I've done many times in the past, these suspension systems were just what you had to work with back in the 1980s. But in contrast to the front suspension here at the back of the bike, in 81 it would have been a pair of S and W units, or in our case here, the much better alternative, a pair of nice Swedish-made Olin shocks that had that remote gas and oil-filled reservoir that was connected to the top of each shock by a high-pressure flexible rubber hose. And even for 1981, these Olins were still considered among some of the best rear suspension systems that you could get for an off-road dirt bike. And as I said, the canister reservoir for the shock was fixed onto the suspension by this connecting pipe, and normally that reservoir that held the precious gas and oil was fixed onto the outside of the bike chassis, where it could be cooled with the ambient air that flowed past the bike while it was being raced. Because as you'd imagine, when the back end of this bike was being worked hard, there was always a certain amount of heat generated by those moving parts. So as we move away from the suspension system onto the fuel storage device of our CanAm, which was of course made of plastic, because the 1980s was just about the time that many motocross bike manufacturers were beginning to move away from the heavier and more expensive to produce steel or alloy tanks in favour of these much better and cheaper to produce plastic items, which, as you can gather, were also able to be manufactured in any colour of the rainbow that took your fancy. But CanAm even added their own disclaimer onto the fuel cap of this bike, just to remind you that the bike was to be used for competition only, and that absolutely no warranty was in force after you wheeled the bike out of the showroom. But as I remember, this fuel tank on our 81 MX6 held just over the 2-gallon mark, so that was usually just about enough fuel to keep our 400 Rotax happy on even the longest of enduro or motocross race events. But as far as seating comfort goes for our CanAm rider. You can see that the seat that's fitted here to the bike certainly looks comfortable enough, although I never actually had the chance to ride one of these orange CanAm Rockets back in the 1980s, so I can't really speak from experience, but at first glance it certainly looks to have enough padding and length so that the rider can move around on the bike with relative comfort. And once again, all of this bike's bodywork, I'm assuming, is still more or less all of the original plastics that CanAm screwed onto this bike at their factory back in '81. Because, as I said, Terry never did a single thing to this bike, and this condition is basically how it arrived on Terry's doorstep from the USA. But then again, I suppose it could maybe have had a bit of refurbishment while it was still over there in the United States. But all of these plastic parts, I have to say, do look original and factory fresh, and parts like the rear and even this front mudguard don't look like they've even had a sniff of track action in the last 20 years. And once more, up here in the CanAm's pilot seat, we've got the bike's original handlebars from 1981, although I suspect that things like the control cables will be new replacements, because I can't see a 43-year-old control cable being very reliable to still use if you were going to put the bike back onto the track. But here on the business end, we have the stock standard Magura ball end alloy levers, with of course their proper leather lever covers there as well. And there's even more original parts still fitted to our CanAm, with this Bombardier gasser throttle twist grip, which is a very rare thing to still see on a bike of this vintage. So as you can gather, there's plenty original components still fixed onto our 81 race bike. And for another added bit of safety, an engine cutoff or kill switch has also been added to this left-hand side of the bars, just in case of any mechanical emergencies with that Rotax power unit. Although with that engine's reliability record, this switch will probably never ever be needed, but I suppose it's better to be safe than sorry. And so, at the end of the day, this bike here has been quite a good purchase for Terry, and it was certainly everything that it was described on the tin when he first decided to buy the bike. So this was a far cry from the condition of that Cagiva that we had a look at in our last video posting, although as I said, Terry's done absolutely nothing to this bike, unlike that Cagiva that he had to basically do a full restoration on. So this is another fantastic original example of a 1981 MX6B CanAm for Terry to place into his collection alongside his many other two-wheeled treasures. But the Brucey bonus of this bike here is that this is the very first MX6B model that came off the CanAm production line in 1981, so that adds that little bit more prestige and provenance to what is already a rare and original example. But coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a short break from Terry's collection and have a look at a couple of quite nice Hagen, Yamaha and Suzuki 4-stroke racers that I spotted at the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show some years back. So make sure that you either return to my channel or, better still, simply subscribe, because that way you'll be notified immediately every time that I upload a brand new video. So for the time being, thanks for watching, and it's cheerio for now.